In 1917, a British engineer named William Tritton created something that the American military immediately rejected, calling it useless and poorly designed. But as World War I turned into a nightmare of trenches and barbed wire, that rejected machine became the secret weapon that broke the bloodiest stalemate in history. This revolutionary tank saved thousands of lives and changed warfare forever. Stay until the end to discover how an initial failure became the greatest military innovation of the 20th century. William Ashby Tritton was born on June 14, 1875, in Islington, London, to a middle-class family with no military tradition. His father was a cloth merchant, and nothing in William's childhood suggested he would one day change the course of modern warfare. But from an early age, young Tritton demonstrated an obsessive fascination with machinery. At age 12, William completely dismantled the wall clock in the family living room. His mother was furious when she found hundreds of pieces scattered across the floor. But 3 days later, the clock not only worked again, but kept time with greater precision than before. It was a harbinger of the mechanical genius that would reveal itself decades later. Tritton abandoned formal education at 16, a decision that horrified his parents. He saw no point in studying Latin and philosophy when steam engines were revolutionizing the world. Instead, he took an apprenticeship in a London engineering workshop, where he worked 12-hour days for meager wages. For 5 years, Tritton learned every aspect of mechanical engineering. He studied technical drawings late into the night, memorized metal properties, and practiced welding until his hands were covered in calluses and burns. His peers considered him obsessive, but his masters recognized exceptional talent. In 1896, at the age of 21, Tritton landed a position with a locomotive company in Leeds. It was brutal work in dangerous conditions, but he loved it. Each locomotive was a unique mechanical puzzle, and Tritton had a gift for solving problems that baffled more experienced engineers. His big break came in 1905, when he was hired by William Foster and Company, an agricultural manufacturer based in Lincoln. The company primarily produced tractors and farm machinery, but was experimenting with motor vehicles, a technology still in its infancy. Tritton quickly distinguished himself. In 1911, at the age of 36, he was promoted to managing director of the company, a position of enormous responsibility. He transformed Foster and Company into a leader in innovation in heavy agricultural machinery, developing tractors that were more powerful and efficient than the competition. But these were dark times in Europe. Political tensions were rising between the great powers. Complex alliances created an unstable network that threatened to explode at any moment. Tritton, focused on his machines, barely paid attention to newspaper headlines about diplomatic crises. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. Like dominoes, European nations declared war on each other. By August, Great Britain was at war with Germany, and the world plunged into the most devastating conflict humanity had ever witnessed. William Tritton was 39 when the war began. He was too old for combat, but his engineering skills would soon be called upon in ways he never could have imagined. The British Army faced a seemingly impossible problem in the trenches of France, and they needed creative minds to solve it. The London cloth merchant was about to invent a weapon that would change warfare forever. A machine that the Americans would initially reject, but which would eventually prove indispensable. By 1915, World War I had become a stagnant nightmare. The battlefronts in France and Belgium consisted of endless networks of trenches stretching for hundreds of kilometers from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Between the opposing trenches lay no man's land, a devastated expanse of bomb craters, barbed wire, and mud, Generals on both sides quickly realized a dire problem. Defensive technology had outpaced offensive technology. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, decimating any infantry that attempted to advance. Heavy artillery could destroy positions miles away. But there was no effective way to cross no man's land and breach enemy defenses. The attempts were horrendously bloody. In the Battle of the Somme, which began in July 1916, the British Army suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day. On the first day, soldiers marched toward German trenches, only to be slaughtered by machine gun fire before advancing 50 meters. Colonel Ernest Swinton, a British Army officer and military writer, witnessed these massacres and became obsessed with finding a solution. He envisioned an armored vehicle that could cross trenches, smash barbed wire, and shield soldiers from enemy fire. A mobile fortress that could finally break the deadlock. Swinton presented his idea to the Army General Staff in 1914, but was ridiculed. Traditional generals considered the proposal absurd. They believed that cavalry and infantry would eventually win, following tactics that had worked for centuries. The idea of tracked fortresses seemed like science fiction, but Swinton had a powerful ally, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill immediately grasped the revolutionary potential of the idea. He established the Shore Ship Committee in February 1915, a deliberately misleading name to keep the project secret. The committee needed someone who could turn their concept into reality. Someone with in-depth knowledge of heavy machinery, the ability to solve complex problems, and the ability to work under extreme pressure. They found William Tritton. Tritton was summoned to a secret meeting in London in March 1915. Military officials explained the problem. They needed an armored vehicle capable of crossing 8-foot-wide trenches, crushing barbed wire, withstanding machine gun fire, and carrying heavy weapons. And they needed it quickly. Most engineers would have considered the specifications impossible. The technology of the time could barely produce reliable automobiles, let alone motorized armored fortresses capable of traversing devastated terrain. But Tritton wasn't most engineers. He returned to Lincoln with preliminary drawings and a seemingly impossible mission. His factory, which normally produced farm tractors, would be transformed into the cradle of a new era of mechanized warfare. Tritton had 6 months to create something never before done. The challenge was monumental. He needed to develop propulsion systems capable of moving 28 tons through deep mud. Armor strong enough to resist bullets, but light enough not to overload the engine. A track system that could cross trenches without breaking. And all this using materials and technology from 1915. Tritton didn't sleep properly for the next 6 months. The future of thousands of soldiers depended on his success. William Tritton assembled a small but talented team of engineers and mechanics. The most important was Major Walter Gordon Wilson, a brilliant naval engineer assigned to work with Tritton. The two men had completely different personalities. Tritton was practical and direct. Wilson was theoretical and meticulous, but they formed an exceptional partnership. The first prototype was a complete disaster. Called Little Willie, the vehicle used conventional wheels at the rear and short tracks at the front. During testing in August 1915, it got stuck in the first ditch it tried to cross. The wheels sank into the mud, the engines overheated, and the steering system was virtually useless. Tritton was discouraged, but not defeated. He spent days analyzing why Little Willie had failed, making meticulous notes on each problem. The fundamental problem was the shape. The center of gravity was off, and the tracks were too short. In September 1915, Tritton had a revolutionary insight. What if, instead of placing the tracks under the vehicle, he wrapped them around it, creating a rhomboidal shape where the tracks circled the entire perimeter of the tank? It would be strange, unconventional, but it could work. Wilson initially thought the idea was crazy. The rhomboidal shape violated every principle of vehicle design. But the more they discussed it, the more they realized it could solve all of Little Willie's problems. The long tracks could cross wide trenches, the low center of gravity would prevent rollovers, and the weight distribution would allow it to traverse deep mud. They worked feverishly on the designs. Tritton slept at the factory, waking up in the middle of the night with ideas that needed to be tested immediately. His team considered him a bit crazy, but they were infected by his enthusiasm. They were building something that had never existed before. The new prototype was called Mother, and its appearance was absolutely bizarre. It looked like a giant metal box with caterpillar tracks encircling its entire body. 6-pound cannons protruded from the sides in compartments called sponsons. It weighed 28 tons and was powered by a 105-horsepower Daimler engine. In January 1916, Mother was ready for testing. A crowd of skeptical military officers gathered in Lincoln to watch. Many wagered that the mechanical monster wouldn't budge. Tritton was nervous but confident. He had personally checked every system, tested every component. The engine roared to life. Mother began moving slowly at first, then picking up speed. She approached a simulated 8-foot-wide trench, the crucial test. The tracks hit the edge, and for a moment it looked like the tank would fall forward. But the diamond-shaped design worked perfectly. The tracks gripped the opposite side of the trench, and Mother crossed as if nothing had happened. The crowd erupted in applause. Officials who had ridiculed the project now proclaimed it genius. Mother then crushed barbed wire, pierced deep mud, and proved virtually impenetrable to rifle fire. It was everything Swinton had imagined and more. The British Army immediately ordered 100 units. The project was codenamed Tank to deceive German spies into believing they were water tanks. The name stuck and became permanent. Tritton had created the first truly effective battle tank in history, but his journey was only beginning. While Great Britain began mass production of Tritton tanks, now officially called the Mark I, the United States watched with cautious interest. America was still neutral in 1916, but many knew it was only a matter of time before they were drawn into the war, the United States War. Department sent a delegation of military observers to England in March 1916 to evaluate the new British tank. The team was led by Colonel Samuel Hough, a veteran artillery officer with 30 years of service. The demonstration took place at a military base near London. Tritton personally presented the Mark I, explaining its capabilities and limitations. He expected enthusiasm, perhaps even orders for production under American license. What he received was icy skepticism. Hough and his team immediately identified legitimate problems. The Mark I was uncomfortably hot inside, with temperatures frequently exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. The steering system was complex and required the coordination of 4 men. The top speed was only 6 kilometers per hour, slower than a man running. And the engine was terribly unreliable, but the criticism went beyond technical issues. Hough wrote in his official report, "This machine represents fundamentally flawed military thinking. It is slow, vulnerable, and expensive. The resources spent building these monsters would be better spent, producing additional artillery and training more. Infantry," the American report concluded. The tanks were a technological dead end and a waste of valuable industrial resources. It recommended that the United States not invest in tank development or production. It was a complete and humiliating rejection. Tritton was devastated when he learned of the American assessment. He had poured his heart into the project, sacrificing health and time with his family, and now one of the world's greatest industrial powers considered it a failure. Preserved letters reveal his frustration. They see only problems, not potential. They don't understand that this is a technology in its infancy, but the British pressed on. In September 1916, the first Mark I tanks were shipped to France. The military command planned to use them in a massive surprise attack that would finally break the trench stalemate. The initial deployment was premature and poorly coordinated. During the Battle of the Somme in September 1916, only 49 tanks participated in the attack. Many broke down before reaching enemy lines. Others were trapped in bomb craters. Of the 49 tanks, only 9 actually reached the German trenches. The mixed results seemed to confirm American skepticism. Critics pointed to mechanical flaws and called the tanks expensive white elephants. Some British officials began to question whether the investment was worthwhile. Tritton vigorously defended his creation. He argued that tanks had been misused, deployed in insufficient numbers, and without adequate infantry support. Given time and proper tactics, he insisted, tanks would prove their worth. The British High Command, impressed by the 9 tanks that actually reached enemy lines and struck terror into the Germans, decided to give Tritton a second chance. They ordered improved versions and planned an operation where tanks would be put to good use. Redemption was coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything. William Tritton spent late 1916 and all of 1917 obsessively improving his tanks. The Mark II fixed basic problems. The Mark III never got beyond prototype. The Mark IV, introduced in May 1917, was significantly improved over the original, thicker armor, a more reliable engine, and a simplified steering system. But technical improvements weren't enough. Tritton knew the tanks needed a decisive victory to prove their worth, a demonstration so impressive that it would silence all critics, including the Americans who had rejected his invention. That opportunity arrived in November 1917 in the French city of Cambrai. General Julian Byng planned something revolutionary, a massive attack led by 476 tanks, supported by carefully coordinated infantry and artillery. It would be the largest tank operation in history. Tritton followed Lincoln's preparations anxiously. He had personally trained many of the crews, explaining every detail of the tanks. He knew that if this operation failed, the concept of tank warfare could die permanently. On the morning of November 20th, 1917, at 6:20 a.m., 476 Mark IV tanks began their advance. The ground was firm, ideal for tank operations. The morning mist provided cover, and for the first time, the tanks operated in coordinated formation, not in isolation. The effect was devastating. The German defenses, considered impenetrable, were crushed within hours. Tanks tore through multiple trench lines, smashed through barbed wire like spiderwebs, and allowed the infantry to advance with minimal casualties. In 6 hours, British forces advanced 8 kilometers, something that had taken months in previous battles. German soldiers reported absolute terror upon seeing the metal monsters emerging from the mist. Many surrendered immediately. Others fled in panic. Machine guns, which had dominated battlefields for 3 years, were useless against the tank's armor. Eyewitnesses described extraordinary scenes. Lieutenant Arthur Arnold wrote in his diary, "I saw a Mark IV cross 3 consecutive trench lines without slowing down. The Germans simply dropped their weapons and ran. It was like watching the war of the future. By the end of the first day, British forces had captured more territory at Cambrai than they had in months of fighting on the Somme." Church bells rang in London for the first time since the war began, celebrating victory. Newspaper headlines proclaimed the triumph of the tanks, but the joy was premature. The Germans recovered, bringing heavy artillery and anti-tank tactics. Many tanks broke down or ran out of fuel. The German counter-offensive recovered most of the lost territory. Cambrai technically ended in a tactical draw, but strategically, Cambrai was a complete victory for the tanks. They had proven, beyond any doubt, that they could break through defenses that had withstood years of artillery bombardment. The concept was valid. The technology worked. The future of warfare had changed. When news of Cambrai reached the United States, the tone changed dramatically. The same War Department that had rejected Tritton's tanks in 1916 was now sending desperate delegations to learn all about them. Colonels who had ridiculed the rhomboidal design were now studying it reverently. William Tritton, the rejected engineer, had been spectacularly vindicated. But the war was far from over, and his greatest challenge was yet to come. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, finally entering World War I. With American entry came a belated but crucial realization. They desperately needed tanks, and they needed them quickly. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, personally witnessed the effectiveness of the tanks at Cambrai. He sent an urgent telegram to Washington. Tanks are essential to modern military success. We must acquire or produce them immediately in large quantities. The American industry, not yet mobilized for mass military production, faced a crucial choice. Should they develop their own design or license proven British or French tanks? American pride favored in-house development, but reality favored pragmatism. In June 1917, an American delegation arrived in Lincoln to meet William Triton. The irony was not lost on them. 18 months earlier, Americans had dismissed his work as useless. Now they were begging for his help. Triton could have been vengeful, but it wasn't in his nature. Soldiers were dying. If his tanks could save them, nationality didn't matter. He welcomed the Americans warmly and fully shared his design specifications and lessons learned. The Americans were impressed by how much tanks had evolved. The Mark IV was dramatically superior to the Mark I they had rejected. More reliable systems, better armor, more powerful weaponry. Triton had transformed a flawed prototype into an effective weapon of war. But adapting British design for American production presented unique challenges. American factories used different imperial measurements, different metallurgical standards, and different manufacturing processes. They couldn't simply copy British plans. Triton spent 3 months in 1917 working with American engineers, adapting their designs to American industrial capabilities. He revised hundreds of drawings, replaced British components with American equivalents, and trained production teams. The result was the Mark VIII Liberty, a joint British-American tank. It was the most advanced tank up to that time, a 300-horsepower Liberty engine, a speed of 8 kilometers per hour, armor up to 16 millimeters thick, and armament including 2 6-pounder cannons and 5 machine guns. But production was slow. Building tanks required massive resources, special steel, powerful engines, complex tracks. And all this while also building ships, planes, artillery, and rifles for millions of soldiers. While American production grew slowly, the United States purchased hundreds of British and French tanks to equip its first armored units. Among them was a young lieutenant colonel named George S. Patton, who would become a legend of tank warfare in World War II. Patton visited Triton in Lincoln in October 1917. The young American officer was obsessed with tanks, seeing them as the future of warfare. He bombarded Triton with questions about tactics, maintenance, and crew training. Triton was impressed by Patton's enthusiasm and tactical acumen. They spent days discussing how tanks should be employed, en masse, with supporting infantry, focusing on exploiting gaps in enemy defenses. These conversations would profoundly influence Patton's tactics decades later. In April 1918, the first American armored units entered combat in France, using French Renault FT tanks. They were small and light compared to Triton's Mark IV, but they proved that Americans could fight effectively in mechanized warfare. The rejected British tank had become an essential weapon in the Allied arsenal, and its evolution was far from over. Between 1917 and 1918, William Triton oversaw the development of multiple specialized tank variants. Trench warfare presented unique challenges that required creative solutions, and Triton's ingenious mind worked tirelessly to solve them. The Mark V, launched in May 1918, featured a revolutionary innovation. For the first time, a single man could control the tank. Previous versions required a commander and 4 crew members operating separate controls just to steer. The new Wilson epicyclic gear system allowed for centralized control, dramatically increasing operational efficiency. Triton also developed the Mark V Star, an elongated version capable of crossing even wider trenches. At 9.8 meters long, it could traverse ditches up to 4.5 meters deep. It looked disproportionately long, almost comical, but it was lethal in combat. One of the most fascinating variants was the supply tank. Triton realized that tanks frequently ran out of ammunition or fuel in the middle of battles. So he created unarmed versions specifically for transporting supplies, allowing combat tanks to operate for longer periods. There were also bridge tanks, equipped with structures that could be extended over particularly wide trenches. Trench-clearing tanks, with machine guns mounted at all angles to attack defensive positions. Even recovery tanks to rescue damaged vehicles from the battlefield. But not all innovations were successful. The Mark VI, designed to be faster and more maneuverable, never made it beyond prototype due to chronic structural problems. The experimental amphibious tank sank spectacularly during initial testing. Triton meticulously documented every failure. He kept detailed notebooks of problems encountered, solutions attempted, and lessons learned. This systematic approach transformed tank development from makeshift art into an engineering science. Production reached an impressive industrial scale. By 1918, British factories were churning out more than 100 tanks a month. Triton's Foster and Company in Lincoln operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The stress was immense. Triton, now 43, worked himself to exhaustion. His health deteriorated under constant pressure. He developed stomach ulcers, chronic insomnia, and lost weight rapidly. But he didn't slow down. As long as men died in the trenches, he felt a moral responsibility to continually improve his machines. In July 1918, the Battle of Amiens demonstrated how much tank warfare had evolved. More than 500 British and French tanks, supported by infantry, aviation and artillery in perfect coordination, crushed German defences in hours. It was called the Black Day of the German Army. German Commander General Erich Ludendorff wrote in his memoirs that Amiens was the moment he realized Germany had lost the war. Tanks, combined with other modern technologies, rendered German defensive tactics obsolete. Triton received reports from Amiens with deep but complicated satisfaction. His machines were saving Allied lives, yes, but they were also killing German soldiers in horrific numbers. He never romanticized what he had created. Tanks were tools of death, and he would carry that reality with him for the rest of his life. In September 1918, it became clear that Germany was on the verge of collapse. Tanks, along with other factors, had finally broken the trench warfare stalemate. The war that should have ended in months had lasted 4 bloody years, but it was finally coming to an end. On November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. The armistice had been signed, and World War I had come to an end. 4 years of carnage had ended. More than 17 million people were dead. Empires had collapsed. The world had been irreversibly changed. William Triton was at his factory in Lincoln when he heard the news. He walked onto the production floor where workers were assembling yet another Mark V. For a long moment, he simply stared at the machine, his creation, his obsession, his legacy. Then, for the first time in 4 years, he ordered the production line to stop. Workers erupted in celebration. Hugs, tears, shouts of joy. The war was over. They had survived. They could return to their families, their lives. But Triton remained silent, his emotions too complex to express. His tanks had saved countless Allied lives, enabling advances that would have been impossible otherwise. But they had also killed thousands. He had created something that made warfare more efficient, more deadly. It was an ambiguous legacy that would haunt him for decades. In the following months, the British Army faced a difficult question: what to do with thousands of now obsolete tanks? Some were scrapped immediately. Others were sold to foreign nations. Many were simply abandoned, slowly rusting in military depots. Triton argued vigorously for preserving at least some tanks as historical monuments. He understood that he had created something historically significant, not only militarily but technologically. His campaign had limited success. Some tanks were preserved in museums, including a Mark IV that would eventually be displayed at the Imperial War Museum in London. For Tritton personally, the post-war period brought recognition and honours. In 1919, he was awarded the Order of the British Empire for his contributions to the war effort. Newspapers celebrated the man who invented the tank, although Tritton always insisted it was a collective effort, but fame brought discomfort. Tritton was an engineer, not a celebrity. He refused most invitations to speak at public events. He preferred to return to the work he loved, solving complex mechanical problems. Foster and Company returned to agricultural machinery production, but never fully recovered its pre-war identity. The factory that had produced tractors for farmers was now known as the birthplace of tanks. Tritton struggled to reconcile these two realities. In 1920, Tritton received an unexpected visit, a delegation from the American War Department. These were some of the same officers who had rejected his tanks in 1916. They came to formally apologize and consult on the future development of American tanks. The meeting was embarrassing for both sides. The Americans admitted they had made a critical error of judgment, completely underestimating the potential of tanks. Their 1916 report was completely wrong, and they acknowledged it. Tritton accepted the apology graciously, but not without pointing out the irony. "You told me my machine was useless," he said calmly. "Now it has changed warfare forever." Perhaps the lesson is that radical innovation always seems impossible until someone makes it a reality. The Americans wanted to hire Tritton as a consultant for their post-war tank development program. They offered a staggering salary and unlimited resources, but Tritton refused. He had given 4 years to war. Now he wanted peace. The 1920s and 1930s were paradoxically cruel for William Tritton and his legacy. While tank technology continued to evolve rapidly in other nations, especially Germany and Russia, Britain largely ignored the weapon it had pioneered. The trauma of World War I created widespread pacifist sentiment. British politicians drastically cut military budgets. Tank development virtually ground to a halt. Tritton's revolutionary designs were shelved and forgotten. Tritton continued working at Foster and Company, but without the resources or urgency of the war years. He developed incremental improvements and proposed innovative designs, but met with little official interest. It was frustrating for a man accustomed to seeing his ideas transformed into reality. Meanwhile, other nations were obsessively studying British World War I tanks. German officials, banned from developing tanks by the Treaty of Versailles, secretly analyzed every aspect of Tritton's designs. Soviet engineers purchased British tanks specifically to disassemble them and understand their construction. Major Heinz Guderian, who would become the architect of the German Blitzkrieg in World War II, studied Tritton's tanks extensively. He recognized that Cambrai had demonstrated the future of warfare, massive formations of tanks moving quickly to exploit gaps in enemy defenses. But in Britain, these lessons were largely ignored. The military establishment returned to prioritizing infantry and cavalry. Tanks were seen as auxiliaries, not the primary weapon. It was a tragic reversal that would prove costly 2 decades later. Tritton watched this decline with growing frustration. He wrote technical papers arguing for the continued importance of tank development. He warned that other nations were surpassing Britain in the technology British had invented. But his warnings were ignored. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. He immediately initiated a massive rearmament program, including accelerated tank development. Ironically, the initial German designs were based directly on Tritton's work, improved with 2 decades of technological refinement. Foster and Company was facing increasing financial difficulties. The Great Depression devastated global markets for agricultural machinery. The company that had saved Britain during the war was now struggling to survive. Tritton, now in his 60s, watched his working life crumble. The company he had helped build was going bankrupt. The technology he had pioneered was being abandoned by his own country. It was bitterly ironic. In 1936, Foster and Company finally closed its doors, unable to compete in depressed markets. Triton was devastated. Decades of work, inventions that changed history, and it all ended in bankruptcy and oblivion. But in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland using improved tank warfare tactics, Britain finally awoke to the reality Triton had warned against. Tanks were not relics of the past. They were the future of warfare, and Britain was dangerously behind. The British government desperately tried to restart tank production. Military officials sought out Triton, now 64, asking for his help again. He was old, tired, and bitter about how his warnings had been ignored. But when his country called, he answered. Once again, William Triton would be called upon to save British soldiers with his inventions. But this time, he was working against an even more relentless clock. World War II spectacularly validated all of William Triton's visions about the future of mechanized warfare. The German blitzkriegs that conquered France in weeks and reached the gates of Moscow demonstrated what tanks could do when employed en masse, with proper tactics and coordinated support. Ironically, these devastating tactics were based on principles that Triton and other British pioneers had established decades earlier. Germany had simply paid attention while Britain forgot its own lessons. During the early years of the war, Triton worked as a consultant for British tank development programs. His age and declining health limited his physical contribution, but his experience was invaluable. He reviewed designs, identified potential problems, and offered solutions based on decades of knowledge. World War II tanks were spectacularly more advanced than their World War I counterparts. The American Sherman, the Soviet T-34, the German Panzer all descended conceptually from Triton's pioneering work, but incorporated 25 years of technological advancements. More powerful engines allowed speeds of 40 kilometers per hour or more. Thicker armor withstood anti-tank guns. Larger cannons could destroy fortifications. Radio communication systems coordinated complex formations. It was extraordinary evolution in a relatively short time. Triton witnessed these innovations with mixed feelings. Pride at having initiated a technological revolution. Sadness that his warnings about the continued importance of tanks had been ignored. Relief that Britain was finally taking armored warfare seriously, and horror that humanity had so efficiently perfected ways of killing each other. In 1941, Triton suffered the first of several heart attacks. His body, worn down by decades of stressful work, was failing. Doctors advised him to retire completely, but he refused as long as the war continued. He felt a responsibility for the soldiers who depended on tanks to survive. During his convalescence, Triton wrote detailed memoirs about the development of the first tank. It was an extraordinary document, blending precise technical details with philosophical reflections on the nature of innovation and the moral cost of military invention. "I created something that saved thousands of lives," he wrote. "But I also created something that took thousands of lives. There is no way to separate these realities. The engineer who builds a bridge cannot control whether it will be used for commerce or invasion. I can only hope that my net contribution was positive." In 1943, when the tide of war finally turned decisively in favor of the Allies, Triton was invited to witness tests of new British tanks. Leaning on a cane, he observed machines that could crush his original Mark IVs like tin cans. A young engineer, unaware of his identity, casually remarked, "It's hard to believe that just 25 years ago, tanks were practically useless, slow, unreliable, poorly armed." Triton smiled sadly. "They weren't useless," he said calmly. "They were revolutionary. You're here today because those useless tanks broke the trench stalemate and saved a generation of soldiers. Never despise pioneers just because later versions are better." The engineer, realizing who he was talking to, was mortified. But Tritton nodded amiably. "You're right that we've dramatically improved the technology. That's how progress works. Each generation builds upon the work of the previous one." The war ended in May 1945 in Europe and in August in the Pacific. William Tritton, now 70, lived to see peace return. But his body was exhausted. He had survived 2 world wars, witnessed extraordinary technological changes, and contributed fundamentally to shaping the 20th century. In 1946, Britain finally properly recognized Tritton's contributions. He was knighted by King George VI, becoming Sir William Tritton. The ceremony was emotional for the aging engineer who had spent his entire life working in relative obscurity. During the ceremony, the king commented, "Your inventions saved thousands of British lives and changed the course of history. The nation is in your debt." Tritton, ever humble, replied, "Your Majesty, I merely solved mechanical problems. It was the brave men who piloted these machines who really made the difference." William Tritton died on September 19, 1946, at the age of 71, of heart failure. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including veterans of both world wars who owed their lives to the tanks he had created. His legacy is complex and profound. He didn't invent the tank alone. It was a collaborative effort involving dozens of engineers, military officers, and visionaries. But he was instrumental in transforming a vague concept into a functional reality. His designs established fundamental principles that influenced tank development for decades. Today, modern tanks bear little resemblance to Tritton's Mark IV. They are extraordinarily sophisticated machines, with computers, laser targeting systems, composite armor, and guns capable of piercing almost any defense. But the fundamental principles, mobility, protection, firepower, remain the same as those established by Tritton a century ago. Monuments to Tritton are few. A plaque in Lincoln marks the site where Foster and Company once operated. A small museum preserves some of his original drawings. But compared to other inventors, he remains relatively unknown. Perhaps it's fitting. Tritton never sought fame. He was an engineer, a problem solver, a pragmatist. When faced with a seemingly impossible challenge, creating a machine that could break the bloodiest stalemate in history, he simply worked until he solved the problem. Their story reminds us that transformative innovation often begins with rejection. The American military dismissed its tanks as useless in 1916. 2 years later, those same useless tanks were helping win the war. Experts often fail to recognize truly revolutionary ideas because they challenge fundamental assumptions. It also reminds us that inventions have complex moral consequences. Tritton created a weapon that saved lives and took lives. There is no simple way to judge this legacy. We can only acknowledge that he faced a dilemma that confronts all military innovators: how to balance patriotic duty with the moral cost of invention. The London boy who took apart his family's clock grew up to create a machine that changed warfare forever. The engineer whose work was rejected by the Americans lived to see his invention become indispensable. The old man who witnessed 2 world wars left a legacy that continues to shape conflicts to this day. William Ashby Tritton was no soldier, but his impact on military history rivals that of the greatest generals. He proved that engineers working quietly in workshops far from the battlefields can change the course of history as profoundly as those who wield weapons. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson, that progress, whether in war or peace, comes not from grandiose speeches or dramatic heroism, but from dedicated people solving difficult problems, one screw at a time. End. In 1918, Germany formally protested that the United States was using a weapon too inhumane for war. This weapon wasn't poison gas, a flamethrower, or a bomb. It was a simple hunting rifle. 20 years later, in the Pacific, Japanese soldiers feared it more than any other American weapon. This is the story of the Winchester M1897 trench gun, the rifle that changed jungle combat forever and became a legend among the Marines. Stay until the end to discover why Japan offered special rewards for capturing only this weapon. The story of the Winchester M1897 trench gun begins not on a battlefield, but on the American plains of the late 19th century. John Moses Browning, perhaps the greatest firearms designer in history, was obsessed with creating a reliable and fast-firing repeating rifle. Browning was born in 1855 in Ogden, Utah, the son of a gunsmith. By the age of 7, he was already working in his father's workshop, cleaning guns and learning basic mechanics. At 13, he manufactured his first functional weapon using scrap metal found in the family's storage shed. He was clearly a prodigy. In 1897, after years of experimentation, Browning finalized the design that would change everything, the Winchester Model 1897. It was a pump-action, 12-gauge shotgun with a capacity of 5 cartridges plus 1 in the chamber. But it had a unique feature that would make it legendary decades later. The M1897 had no trigger disconnector. This meant that if the shooter held the trigger down while pumping the action, the weapon would fire automatically as soon as the chamber closed. A skilled shooter could fire all 6 rounds in under 2 seconds. It was devastating at short range. Winchester marketed the M1897 primarily to hunters and farmers. It was robust, reliable, and relatively inexpensive. Thousands were sold to civilians who needed protection against wild animals or for hunting birds. No one imagined it would become a weapon of war. The weapon had another remarkable feature: brutal simplicity. The mechanism was straightforward, with few moving parts. It could be disassembled and cleaned quickly, even by users without technical training. And it could function in conditions that would render more complex weapons inoperable. The M1897 weighed approximately 3.6 kilograms unloaded. The barrel was 51 centimeters long in the standard version, but Winchester offered variations. The tubular magazine under the barrel held 5 12-gauge cartridges, and the pump action was smooth and reliable. For years, the M1897 remained simply an excellent civilian rifle. Sheriffs used it, hunters loved it, stagecoach guards carried it. It was a common American tool, not particularly noteworthy in the vast firearms market. Then came World War I. In 1917, the United States entered the European conflict, and the army immediately faced a terrible problem: trench warfare. The trenches were narrow, labyrinthine, and full of blind corners. Long-range rifles were useless in these conditions. Soldiers needed something for close-quarters combat. Someone in the War Department had a radical idea. What if we used hunting rifles? Specifically, the trusty Winchester M1897. The suggestion was initially ridiculed. Rifles were for hunting ducks, not for modern warfare. But the desperate situation demanded creative solutions. The Army ordered militarized versions of the M1897. Winchester added a bayonet compatible with the Springfield M1903, a heat shield on the barrel, and a leather carrying handle. The M1897 trench gun was born, and its debut in the war would be so brutal that it would generate international protest. No one knew it yet, but John Browning had created something that would terrify enemy soldiers on 2 continents throughout 2 worlds. Was the first Winchester M1897 trench guns. Arrived in France in March 1918. American soldiers received them with skepticism. Many had hunted with similar rifles at home, but using a hunting weapon in combat seemed amateurish, almost embarrassing. This skepticism evaporated the first time trench guns were used in actual combat. During a trench-clearing operation near Belleau Wood, A platoon of Marines equipped with M1897s faced German soldiers entrenched in a complex network of defensive positions. The trenches were a claustrophobic nightmare. Narrow passages 2 meters deep, blind corners every few meters, makeshift bunkers, and virtually non-existent lighting. Conventional rifles were slow and inaccurate in those conditions, but shotguns were perfect. A Marine named Sergeant Daniel McCarthy would become famous for his skill with the trench gun. In a post-action report, he described a typical encounter. "We turned the corner of the trench, and there were 6 Germans less than 5 meters away. I fired 6 times before they could raise their weapons. It took maybe 2 seconds. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical one. Each 12-gauge cartridge contained 9 pistol-sized lead pellets. The short-range dispersion was lethal. A single discharge could hit multiple targets or cause catastrophic injuries to a single target." German soldiers began to fear the distinctive sound of the Winchester rifle's pumping action. It was unmistakable. The metallic clack-clack followed by a deafening bang. Some Germans would try to surrender immediately upon hearing that sound, preferring prison to facing the rifle. But the brutal effectiveness of the trench gun caused international controversy. In September 1918, the German government lodged a formal protest through neutral diplomatic channels. They claimed that the rifles caused unnecessary suffering and violated the Hague Convention. The German protest was technically inconsistent, considering that Germany itself used flamethrowers and poison gas. But it touched on a real philosophical debate about the nature of human weapons. Rifle wounds were particularly horrific. Multiple impacts from large projectiles caused massive trauma. The United States categorically rejected the protest. The Secretary of State declared that rifles were perfectly legitimate for military use and that the U.S. would continue employing them. Furthermore, they warned that any American soldier captured with a rifle would receive standard prisoner of war treatment, or there would be retaliation. The controversy only increased the legendary status of the trench gun. American newspapers published stories about the rifle the Germans fear. Recruits specifically requested rifle training. The weapon that had been met with skepticism became a symbol of American ferocity. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, trench guns had proven their undeniable value in close combat. The Army kept thousands in stock, anticipating their usefulness in future conflicts. They were absolutely right. The next time the Winchester M1897s roared into battle would be in an even more brutal environment, the deadly jungles of the Pacific against an even more determined and fanatical enemy. And there they would become truly legendary. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor dragged the United States into World War II. Within weeks, the Japanese Empire conquered vast stretches of the Pacific, the Philippines, Malaya, Indonesia, Burma. The offensive was swift, brutal, and seemingly unstoppable. The United States faced an unprecedented military challenge, fighting across thousands of Pacific islands, each covered in dense jungle and defended by Japanese soldiers determined to fight to the death. It was the kind of war for which the American Army and Marines were unprepared. The Pacific jungles were hostile environments beyond imagination. Suffocating heat of 35–40 degrees Celsius with humidity close to 100%. Vegetation so dense that visibility was often reduced to a few meters. Tropical diseases decimated troops, and ambushes were constant. Japanese soldiers were formidable adversaries. Trained in infiltration tactics and night combat, they were masters at using terrain to their advantage. Hidden bunkers, interconnected tunnels, deadly traps, and above all, a fanatical determination to fight to the last man. Japanese tactics preferred silent infiltration, followed by brutal surprise attacks at extremely short ranges. They frequently attacked at night, when American numerical advantage and superior equipment were minimized. Combat quickly degenerated into bloody hand-to-hand chaos. Standard rifles like the M1 Garand were excellent weapons, but they had limitations in jungle combat. Long and heavy, they were difficult to maneuver in dense vegetation and at short distances. Their accuracy was less important than volume of fire. It was then that someone remembered the trench guns from World War I. Thousands of Winchester M1897s had been stored in depots for 20 years. They were old but functional, and perhaps they were exactly what the Marines needed for jungle combat. In February 1942, the Marine Corps initiated a program to reissue rifles to troops in the Pacific. The M1897 rifles were removed from stock, inspected, refurbished, and sent forward. Along with them were sent thousands of rounds of .20 buckshot ammunition, 9 8.4mm lead pellets per round. The first unit to receive rifles in significant numbers was the 1st Marine Division. Preparing for an operation on an island called Guadalcanal, veteran Marines immediately recognized the potential value of the rifles. Young recruits needed convincing. Shooting demonstrations quickly changed minds. An instructor placed 6 human silhouette targets in a semicircle with a radius of 3 meters. He fired all 6 cartridges from the M1897 in less than 3 seconds, hitting all 6 targets. The firepower was impressive, but nobody really knew how the rifles would perform in real jungle combat. Testing weapons in a training field was one thing. Using them against determined and skilled Japanese soldiers in a hostile environment was completely different. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal would soon find out, and what they discovered would change jungle warfare doctrine forever. The Winchester M1897, the old hunting rifle, was about to become the most feared weapon in the Pacific. On August 7, 1942, the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, initiating the first major American offensive in the Pacific. The island was considered secondary, but its airstrip made it strategically critical. What was supposed to be a quick operation turned into a brutal 6-month campaign. The first few days were relatively calm. Marines captured the airfield with little resistance, but then the Japanese counterattacked fiercely. And it was in the savage combat that followed that the Winchester M1897s proved their deadly worth. The Battle of the Tenaru River, on August 21, 1942, was the baptism of fire for rifles. Approximately 900 Japanese soldiers launched a suicidal night attack against American positions. They attacked in dense waves, shouting and firing, attempting to overwhelm defenders through sheer force and ferocity. Sergeant John Basilone, who would later receive the Medal of Honor, was among the defenders. His unit included several Marines armed with M1897s. He described the battle in a post-action report. They came in en masse, too close for machine guns to be effective. But the rifles were perfect. Trench guns transformed the battle. At close range, 10-15 meters, each shot hit multiple attackers. The sound of the rifles pumping and firing rapidly was incessant, and the psychological effect on the attackers was devastating. Japanese soldiers began to hesitate when they heard that characteristic sound. Following Tenaru, field reports began to highlight the exceptional effectiveness of shotguns. One official report noted, 12-gauge shotguns are extraordinarily effective in close-quarters combat. One man with a shotgun is equivalent to 3 with rifles in engagements under 20 meters, but the M1897s weren't without their problems. The extreme humidity of the jungle caused rust to spread quickly. Mud and sand clogged the mechanisms, and the waxed paper cartridges, designed for hunting in temperate climates, swelled and disintegrated in the tropical humidity. Marines developed obsessive maintenance techniques. They cleaned their rifles multiple times a day. They covered them in heavy oil, some improvised waterproof covers using pieces of canvas. A rifle that worked was a rifle that kept its owner alive. Regarding ammunition, Marines discovered that fresh cartridges were essential. Ammunition stockpiled for decades frequently failed. The Corps accelerated production of new cartridges specifically for tropical environments, using moisture-resistant brass cases instead of paper. Specific tactics for shotguns emerged. Marines discovered they were devastating for bunker clearing. A man with an M1897 could clear a fortified position faster and with less risk than an entire team with rifles. They were also excellent for ambushes and perimeter defense. Japanese soldiers began to develop a morbid respect for rifles. Captured diaries specifically mentioned American weapons that fire many times rapidly. Some Japanese soldiers mistakenly believed they were portable machine guns. When the Guadalcanal campaign ended in February 1943, rifles had established themselves as an essential weapon for jungle combat. Requests for more units flooded headquarters, but production of the M1897 had ceased in 1920. The Army needed an alternative. Winchester quickly developed the Model 12, an improved rifle based on the M1897, but thousands of older M1897s remained in service, preferred by many Marines who trusted in their proven simplicity and reliability. As the war in the Pacific progressed through 1943, the Japanese adapted their tactics. Realizing they could not win in daytime combat against superior American firepower, they became masters of night infiltration. And it was in this environment that the Winchester M1897 rifles became truly legendary. The Japanese night attacks were terrifying. Soldiers silently infiltrated American lines, closing in within inches of positions before attacking with bayonets, swords, and grenades. In total darkness, amid confusion and panic, defenders often shot their own men. Shotguns dramatically changed this dynamic. In darkness, long-range accuracy was irrelevant. What mattered was massive firepower across a wide arc. And in that, no weapon surpassed the M1897 with buckshot. Corporal Mitchell Page, another Medal of Honor recipient, described defending a position against a night attack on Guadalcanal. You couldn't see anything. You could only hear movement in the vegetation. With a rifle, you had one shot, and if you missed, they were right on top of you. With a shotgun, you aimed at the sound and fired. 9 projectiles covered a wide area. You were almost certain to hit something. The Marines developed a technique called fan defense. Men with rifles were positioned at key points in the perimeter. When infiltrators were detected, the riflemen fired in a fan pattern, creating a deadly zone that was virtually impossible to cross. The M1897's rapid rate of fire was crucial. Japanese infiltrators often attacked in groups of 3 or 4 men. A rifleman could engage one target at a time. A sniper with an M1897 could eliminate an entire group in 2 seconds. Almost mythological stories emerged. A Marine named Anthony Casamento supposedly defended an isolated position all night against waves of Japanese attacks, using only his M1897 and ammunition boxes. When dawn broke, more than 20 enemy bodies were scattered in a semicircle around his position. Japanese officers began issuing specific orders regarding American rifles. Captured documents contained instructions such as, avoid close engagements with enemies wielding short-barreled weapons that fire multiple projectiles. Some commanders offered rewards to soldiers who captured intact rifles for study, but the Japanese respect for rifles went beyond tactical effectiveness. There was a deep psychological element. The sound of the M1897, the distinctive pumping followed by the thunder of the discharge, had become associated with imminent and inevitable death. Soldiers who survived rifle encounters carried trauma. Marines who carried rifles developed an almost mystical reputation. They were called trench sweepers or riot gunners. Often volunteers, they were chosen for their calm temperament and ability to function in chaotic close-quarters combat. Riflemen's training was intensive. In addition to basic marksmanship, they practiced instinctive shooting, aiming and firing without careful sights. They repeatedly trained to remain calm while targets advanced rapidly. And above all, they learned to keep their rifles functioning in the most adverse conditions. In 1944, as Marines advanced through the islands of the Central Pacific, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, the rifles were there. On every island, in every jungle, on every dark night, the distinctive sound of the Winchester M1897 was synonymous with American Marines fighting for survival. As the war progressed, Marines in the field began modifying and adapting their Winchester M1897 rifles to optimize performance in specific Pacific conditions. These unauthorized modifications often violated military regulations, but proved so effective that commanders turned a blind eye. A popular modification was to saw the barrel to lengths of 35-40 centimeters, instead of the standard 51 centimeters. Shorter barrels were easier to maneuver in dense vegetation and tight bunkers. The increased dispersion at short range was seen as an advantage, not a disadvantage. Some Marines also removed the entire stock, replacing it with an improvised pistol grip. This transformed the M1897 into an extremely compact weapon that could be carried and fired with one hand, while the other held a flashlight or grenade. It was physically punishing. The 12-gauge recoil was brutal without the full stock, but devastatingly effective in emergency combat. Experimentation with ammunition was also common. While 00 buckshot, 9 8.4mm spheres was standard, some Marines preferred 00 buckshot, 6 9.1mm spheres for greater stopping power. Others used solid slugs to penetrate fortifications or cut through dens. Vegetation, one particularly creative innovation, was mixed cartridges. Marines would alternately load buckshot and slug rounds into the magazine. This allowed them to engage both personnel, buckshot, and fortified positions, slug, without needing to reload. The technique required careful memorization of which type of cartridge was in the chamber. Unit armorers, unofficial mechanics who kept weapons running, developed remarkable expertise. They learned to polish metal surfaces to better resist rust. They created special lubricant mixtures that worked in tropical humidity. Some even fabricated makeshift replacement parts when official supplies were unavailable. Maintaining rifles became almost a ritual. Marines cleaned them obsessively, often multiple times a day. After a patrol or combat, the first thing they did was clean their rifle thoroughly before even eating or sleeping. A malfunctioning rifle was a death sentence. Tactical techniques also evolved. Marines developed duo tactics, where two men worked as a team, one with a rifle for medium engagements, the other with a shotgun for close cover. This partnership was especially effective on patrols through hostile territory. In urban combat, which became relevant as Marines fought through towns and cities in the Philippines, rifles were irreplaceable. Clearing buildings was a tactical nightmare. Every door, every corner was a potential deadly ambush. Marines with M1897s developed a dynamic entry technique, kicking down doors and immediately firing into the environment. Intelligence officers noted that Japanese soldiers often surrendered more quickly when facing Marines with visible rifles. There was something about the M1897's distinctive profile, with its short barrel and exposed action, that was immediately recognizable and terrifying. The reputation of shotguns reached the American public through war correspondence. Reports describe Marines equipped with deadly shotguns clearing Japanese bunkers. Photos of grim-faced Marines carrying their customized shotguns appeared in magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post. The Winchester M1897 had transcended its role as a military weapon. It had become a symbol of the ferocity and adaptability of the American Marines in the Pacific. And the war was far from over. In 1944 and 1945, the Pacific Campaign reached its bloody climax. Marines fought through some of the war's most brutal battles: Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the recapture of the Philippines. And in each of these hellish campaigns, the Winchester M1897 rifles proved their worth time and again. The attack on Iwo Jima in February-March 1945 was particularly brutal. The entire island was a fortress, miles of interconnected tunnels, reinforced concrete bunkers, hidden artillery positions. Every meter of territory cost American blood, Rifles were essential for clearing tunnel complexes. Marines developed a specific technique, a fragmentation grenade thrown into the tunnel, immediately followed by a Marine with an M1897 entering and firing at any survivors. It was extremely dangerous but effective. Sergeant Darrell Cole, who posthumously received the Medal of Honor on Iwo Jima, was known for his skill with a rifle. Witnesses described him leading assaults on fortified positions, using his M1897 to eliminate defenders at near hand-to-hand range before throwing demolition charges. Okinawa, from April to June 1945, was even more terrible. The battle lasted 82 bloody days, with massive casualties on both sides. And it was in Okinawa that one of the most notable incidents involving rifles occurred. During the defense of an isolated position, a small group of Marines was surrounded by a substantially larger Japanese force. For 3 days, they withstood constant attacks. Of the 8 Marines, 3 carried M1897 rifles. When they were finally rescued, more than 60 dead Japanese soldiers were scattered around the position, most apparently victims of rifle fire. The Japanese area commander reportedly offered a special reward, promotion, and leave to any soldier who captured one of the multi-shot weapons intact. This confirms, through captured documents, the morbid respect the Japanese had developed for rifles in the Philippines, where Marines and soldiers fought through densely populated urban areas. Rifles faced a new challenge. Urban combat demanded careful discrimination between combatants and civilians. The rifle's wide dispersion pattern was a disadvantage in situations where accuracy was critical. Experienced marksmen adapted to using solid slugs in urban situations, reserving buckshot for jungle combat and bunker clearing. This required remarkable discipline, switching ammunition types under combat stress, while maintaining mental control of which cartridge was loaded. Stories of individual feats with rifles continued to accumulate. A Marine named Mitchell Red Cloud Jr. reportedly single-handedly defended a machine gun position after his entire team was killed, using his M1897 to repel successive waves of attackers until he succumbed to his wounds. Combat fatigue was a serious concern. Marines fought for weeks or months without adequate rest, in conditions that ravaged both body and mind. But even exhausted, those carrying rifles had to maintain constant attention to the upkeep of their weapons. As 1945 progressed and it became clear that Japan was losing the war, the fighting paradoxically intensified. Japanese soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew they were facing final defeat. And in these last desperate battles, the M1897s continued their deadly work. When the atomic bombs were dropped in August 1945 and Japan finally surrendered, the Winchester M1897 rifles had served in virtually every major Pacific campaign. Estimates suggest that thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed by these rifles over 4 years of brutal war. When World War II ended in August 1945, the Winchester M1897 rifles that had served so fiercely in the Pacific faced an uncertain fate. Thousands were worn down by years of brutal use in harsh tropical conditions, but many were still perfectly functional. The Marine Corps, recognizing the proven value of the rifles, decided to keep them in active service. The M1897s were returned to the United States, inspected, refurbished when necessary, and stored. Newer models, such as the Winchester Model 12 and the Ithaca Model 37, were entering service, but the older trench guns remained available. Veterans who had used the M1897 in the Pacific had an almost emotional relationship with the weapons. Many tried to buy them back upon demobilization, but military regulations made this difficult. Some mysteriously disappeared from inventories, presumably taken home by veterans who couldn't part with the weapons that had saved their lives. The reputation of shotguns in the Pacific influenced civilian policing. Police departments across the United States began adopting shotguns for riot control and high-risk situations. The M1897 was particularly popular for its proven robustness and reliability, but the story of the M1897 in military service was far from over. In 1950, when the Korean War began, Marines once again found themselves in close-quarters combat against a determined enemy. And once again, the old Winchester rifles were taken out of storage. In Korea, rifles proved their lessons from the Pacific remained relevant. During the brutal Battle of Chosin Reservoir in the winter of 1950-51, where Marines fought against waves of Chinese attackers in temperatures of 40 degrees below zero, the M1897s continued to function when more modern weapons froze. One remarkable aspect was that 30-year-old rifles were still reliable. John Browning's simple mechanisms, built with generous tolerances and quality steel, proved to be virtually indestructible. While modern automatic rifles jammed in extreme cold, the M1897s kept firing. World War II veterans who had used rifles in the Pacific were now using them again in Korea, this time as experienced sergeants and lieutenants. They were teaching a new generation of Marines the same techniques they had learned a decade earlier. Institutional knowledge was being passed on. The Vietnam War brought the M1897 back to jungle combat, its original domain. Although most units used more modern rifles like the Ithaca 37 or Remington 870, some older M1897s were still in service, particularly among special forces and advisors. In Vietnam, rifles were used extensively for ambushes, base defense, and tunnel operations. The Viet Cong tunnels were particularly dangerous, claustrophobic networks where combat occurred in total darkness at distances of only a few meters. Tunnel rats, soldiers specialized in exploring tunnels, often preferred rifles. A Vietnam veteran described the tunnel encounter: "You're crawling in complete darkness with only a small flashlight. Suddenly there's movement ahead. There's no time to think, only to react. The rifle fills the entire tunnel with projectiles. It's your only chance to survive." Ironically, some of the M1897s used in Vietnam were the same weapons that had fought in the Pacific 25 years earlier. There were rifles with arsenal markings from 1918, weapons that had served in 3 separate wars across half a century. The longevity of the M1897 in military service is an extraordinary testament to Browning's design. While most weapons become obsolete in a decade or two, the Winchesters have proven their worth through 3 major conflicts in radically different environments. The Winchester M1897 trench gun was finally officially retired from American military service in the 1970s, ending an operational career of more than 50 years. But its legacy continued to influence military doctrine and popular culture for decades. The tactical impact of rifles in the Pacific led to fundamental changes in how militaries thought about close-quarters combat. The concept of CQB, close-quarters battle, developed in part based on lessons learned from the M1897 modern special forces, including Navy SEALs and Army Rangers, still train extensively with combat rifles. The principles established by the Marines in the Pacific, massive firepower in a wide arc, speed over accuracy, ability to engage multiple targets, remain valid. The M1897 has also become a cultural icon. It has appeared in countless war films, video games, and works of fiction. Its distinctive silhouette, exposed barrel, pump action, wooden handguard is instantly recognizable to firearms enthusiasts. Collectors pay premium prices for authentic M1897 trench guns, especially those with proven military markings. Examples in original condition can be worth tens of thousands of dollars. Some with a documented service history in the Pacific are considered priceless historical treasures in military museums throughout. The United States display the M1897 as part of their World War II collections. The National Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, Virginia, has a section dedicated to rifles, including examples that served on Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Veterans who used the M1897 in the Pacific Many now 90 or older still speak reverently about the weapons. In veterans' reunions and oral history interviews, they describe the rifles as tools that saved their lives time and again. A 95-year-old veteran interviewed in 2020 said that rifle weighed maybe 4 kilos. But when you're in the dark jungle and you hear Japanese people approaching, it feels like it weighs nothing. It was an extension of yourself. You didn't think, you just pointed and fired. And it never missed. The influence of the M1897 extends beyond military applications. Modern pump-action rifles for police and home defense owe much to Browning's design. The concept of the rifle as a short-range defensive weapon was largely established by the reputation of trench guns, modern firearms. Manufacturers still produce replicas and updated versions of the M1897. Companies like Norinco in China produce near-exact copies. Inland Manufacturing in the United States recently released a modernized version while retaining key features of the original design. Historical rifle shooting competitions often include categories for the M1897. Competitive shooters demonstrate the slam fire technique, holding the trigger down and pumping rapidly. That makes the M1897 unique. Skilled shooters can empty the weapon in less than 2 seconds, just as Marines did decades ago. The weapon also influenced video game design. Popular games like Call of Duty, Battlefield, and Medal of Honor include versions of the M1897, often portrayed as an extremely powerful weapon at close range. Millions of players have virtually experienced what Marines actually experienced. For the military community, especially the Marines, the M1897 remains a symbol of adaptability and brutal effectiveness. It represents an era when Marines literally used any tool available to complete a mission, improvising and innovating under pressure. When reflecting on the impact of the Winchester M1897 trench gun on the Pacific War, we are confronted with a fascinating paradox. A weapon designed in 1897 for civilian hunters became one of the most feared military weapons of the 20th century. A tool initially rejected as unsuitable for modern warfare proved devastatingly effective. The story of the M1897 teaches us profound lessons about the nature of military innovation. The most effective weapons are not always the most technologically advanced or the most expensive. Sometimes, simplicity and reliability trump sophistication. Browning's 1897 design performed better in the jungles of the Pacific than many weapons decades newer. Adaptability was key. The M1897 wasn't designed for tropical jungle combat. It wasn't designed for bunker clearing or defense against night attacks. But Marines adapted the tool to the specific needs they faced. That adaptability of both the weapon and the men who used it was crucial. The psychological aspect cannot be underestimated. Japanese soldiers were exceptionally determined and courageous adversaries, willing to fight to the death even in impossible situations. But rifles terrified them in a way that other weapons could not. There was something viscerally terrifying about multiple large projectiles in lethal dispersion. Captured Japanese documents reveal this psychology. A 1944 Japanese tactical manual included a specific section on American multi-spread weapons, advising soldiers to avoid close engagements when these weapons were present. This is remarkable. Japanese commanders literally altered tactics specifically because of the rifles. The fact that Germans in World War I and Japanese in World War II both developed a specific fear of the same rifles is extraordinary. There are not many weapons in history that have generated this kind of terrified awe from multiple adversaries over decades. Economics was also a factor. An M1897 cost a fraction of the price of a modern automatic rifle. Ammunition was cheap and widely available. Maintenance was simple enough for any soldier to perform. In a war of attrition that consumed massive resources, this economy had real significance. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how the M1897 exemplifies a fundamental military principle: the right weapon for the right situation. In long-range combat in open terrain, rifles were useless. But in dense jungles, dark tunnels, night combat, precisely the conditions that defined the Pacific War, they were unparalleled. This raises an interesting question about military planning. Militaries often prepare for the next war based on the last one. In 1941, the American Army was equipped primarily for conventional combat in open terrain, modeled on the experiences of World War I in Europe. Nobody was prepared for the jungles of the Pacific. That thousands of antique rifles were in storage was almost accidental. They had been kept primarily because disposing of them was troublesome, not because anyone foresaw a future need. But this accidental redundancy proved life-saving when the Pacific combat environment made rifles essential. There is irony in how a rejected weapon became indispensable. In 1918, Germans protested that rifles were inhumane. In 1942, American military personnel initially viewed them as inadequate relics compared to modern automatic weapons. Both assessments proved completely wrong when confronted with the reality of combat. This suggests that established military expertise sometimes errs spectacularly in assessing weapons' effectiveness. Experts in Washington in 1942 couldn't truly understand the conditions Marines would face on Guadalcanal. Only actual combatants in real conditions could determine which weapons performed best. The practice of allowing Marines in the field to modify their rifles, sawing off barrels, altering stocks, experimenting with ammunition, violated regulations but proved essential. The best innovators were often sergeants and corporals with direct combat experience, not engineers in offices. The history of the M1897 also illustrates the importance of institutional knowledge. World War I veterans passed on lessons about rifle use to a new generation. In World War II, these veterans then taught Marines in the Korean War. This continuity of knowledge across generations was crucial. For Japanese soldiers who faced the rifles, the experience was a nightmare that defied their training and expectations. They had been taught that spirit and determination could overcome superior technology. But against Marines with M1897s in nighttime jungle combat, spirit was not enough. Diaries and letters from captured Japanese soldiers reveal profound fear. One soldier wrote, "The American guns firing so often are impossible to avoid. You hear the sound, and you know death is coming. There's no way to protect yourself." This psychological terror was as significant as physical lethality. The legacy of the M1897 extends to this day. Every time special forces use shotguns to storm buildings, every time police officers carry shotguns for high-risk situations, every time someone chooses a shotgun for home defense, they are following a precedent set by the Marines in the Pacific with their Winchester M1897s, the weapon that the Germans called inhumane in 1918, and that the Japanese feared in the Pacific was, in the end, just a tool. It wasn't morally good or bad. It was effective for a specific purpose under specific conditions. But in the hands of determined Marines fighting for survival in hellish jungles, it became something legendary. John Moses Browning died in 1926. Decades before his invention, achieved legendary status in the Pacific. He never knew that the shotgun designed for duck hunters would become one of the most feared combat weapons in history. But his genius for simple, robust, and effective design has proven timeless. The Winchester Model 1897 trench gun didn't win the Pacific War on its own. But in the hands of courageous Marines facing relentless adversaries in impossible conditions, it gave them a crucial advantage that saved countless lives. For soldiers who carried it through jungles, tunnels, and dark nights, it was more than a weapon. It was a reliable companion, a lethal protector, and often the difference between life and death. And for Japanese soldiers who faced it, It was something simpler and more terrifying. It was the worst nightmare come true. The clack-clack sound, followed by the thunder of the discharge, meant that death had arrived, swift and inevitable. The rejected rifle had become exactly what its critics swore it would never be, a devastatingly effective weapon of war. And in the process, it changed how close-quarters combat was conducted forever. ND.